During the Cold War, some of America's most powerful nuclear weapons were not hidden in remote bunkers. They were riding the same freight rails as ordinary cargo, disguised among everyday trains. Here was the paradox. A nuclear missile locked inside a hardened silo sounds invulnerable, but every silo had a known address, and by the late 1970s, Soviet warheads were accurate enough to land within a few hundred feet of each one. A fixed missile was a sitting duck. So American planners faced an almost impossible question. How do you hide a weapon that big in plain sight? The answer they devised was as audacious as it was terrifying, and it very nearly became real. By the mid-1970s, U.S. nuclear strategists faced a threat that felt both technical and existential. Soviet engineers had been steadily improving their missile guidance, shrinking the margin of error from nearly 1 kilometer to just a few hundred meters. With each new generation, Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles like the R-36M and UR-100N could land warheads ever closer to their intended targets. The numbers told a stark story. The R-36M Mod 4, fielded in 1979, boasted an accuracy of about 920 meters, and later models claimed as little as 500 meters. The UR-100N, meanwhile, entered service with CEP, circular error probable, ranging from 220 to 550 meters, depending on the variant. For U.S. planners, these figures meant that the old assumption of safety behind thick concrete and steel was starting to look like wishful thinking. Every American missile silo had a fixed location, mapped and cataloged by Soviet intelligence satellites. It did not matter how many warheads the Soviets built if they could not hit the mark, but as accuracy improved, each warhead became far more dangerous. The logic was simple. When the target never moves, even a modest improvement in accuracy can turn a hardened bunker into a bullseye. Intelligence estimates warned that if Soviet missiles could consistently hit within 400 to 470 meters, as many as 90% of the U.S. Minuteman silos could be destroyed in a surprise attack. This possibility haunted Pentagon briefings and presidential memos, fueling a sense of urgency that went far beyond the raw numbers. The language of defense planning shifted to reflect this anxiety. Officials began to talk about a window of vulnerability, a period when American land-based missiles might be wiped out before they could be launched. This was not just a technical debate. It was a question of national survival. The credibility of unmarked of America's nuclear deterrent depended on the enemy believing there would always be enough missiles left to strike back. If the Soviets believed they could eliminate that threat in a single, well-aimed blow, the entire balance of deterrence could collapse. Behind closed doors, policy memos and intelligence reports traced the outlines of this danger. The response was not simply to build more missiles, but to find a way to keep them hidden, moving, and unpredictable. The problem was not just how many weapons each side possessed, but whether those weapons could be found and destroyed before they ever left the ground. In the world of nuclear strategy, accuracy had become the most dangerous weapon of all. Making the target move was the simplest way to break the attacker's plan. For decades, nuclear strategy had relied on the idea that hardened silos could survive anything the enemy could throw at them. But as missile accuracy closed in on the limits of concrete and steel, the thinking shifted. If a missile could be anywhere, at any time, the odds of destroying it with a single, well-aimed strike dropped sharply. A moving launcher forced an adversary to search, to guess, and to spread their warheads thin. The problem of targeting multiplied. Instead of knowing the exact coordinates, the attacker faced a shell game with dozens or even hundreds of possible locations. The United States already had a tool for this kind of dispersal. The commercial freight rail system stretched over 140,000 miles, weaving through cities, farmland, and remote countryside. Trains could cross the continent in a matter of days, blending in with the constant flow of boxcars, tankers, and hoppers. Using the existing rail network meant no need to build a new, dedicated infrastructure. The hardware was already in place, and the movement of trains was so routine that a single missile launcher could vanish into the background noise of American commerce. This approach changed the math of deterrence. Instead of counting on thick walls and deep silos, planners began to see survivability as a matter of uncertainty. If an enemy could not be sure where the missiles were, they could not be sure their first strike would succeed. The logic favored mobility over static defense. Every hour a missile spent in motion was an hour the adversary's targeting data grew stale. In this world, the threat was not just the weapon itself, but the possibility that it might still be out there ready to respond. The mere act of moving a missile made it harder to destroy, and that uncertainty, spread across thousands of miles of track, became a new form of protection. In the early 1960s, the idea of hiding nuclear missiles on freight trains moved from drawing board to steel and rivets. The Air Force commissioned a series of mobile Minuteman test trains, determined to prove that a missile could travel the nation's rails, blend into commercial traffic, and be made launch-ready on command. These were not just models or simulations. 4 prototype trains were built, each equipped with a launch car, power car, and crew quarters. The trains rolled out from Hill Air Force Base in Utah under the watchful eye of Strategic Air Command, running cross-country exercises that covered thousands of miles and snaked through 21 different railroad systems. Operation Big Star, a series of field tests in the summer of 1960, put the entire concept through its paces. The trains stopped at sidings, crossed bridges, and navigated both urban and rural tracks, all while following the same rules as ordinary freight. Engineers measured how the heavy launch cars affected the rails, checked the reliability of hydraulic lifts, and ran practice drills to raise the missile from its horizontal transport cradle to a vertical launch position. Each dry run included a full guidance system checkout, simulating what it would take to launch a Minuteman YCBM directly from the tracks. The tests revealed both promise and challenge. The train successfully navigated the existing rail network, showing that missile cars could move with the flow of American commerce and avoid standing out. The hydraulic systems managed to elevate the missile smoothly during rehearsals, and the guidance checks worked as intended. But the weight of the launch car pushed the limits of standard rail infrastructure, and engineers logged concerns about rail bed deflection and the long-term reliability of the raise mechanism under real-world conditions. Despite these hurdles, the mobile Minuteman tests proved that a missile train was more than a Cold War fantasy. For a brief window, the United States had rolling proof that nuclear firepower could be hidden in plain sight, ready to move at a moment's notice. Despite the technical promise shown by the mobile Minuteman test trains, the concept never advanced beyond the prototype phase. Engineers struggled with launch stability, especially the problem of railbed deflection under the massive weight of a loaded missile car. Even minor shifts in the track could throw off the missile's alignment, raising doubts about whether a launch from the rails would be reliable in real-world conditions. The hydraulic systems designed to raise the missile from its transport cradle to a vertical position also showed signs of wear and vulnerability during repeated drills. These technical uncertainties lingered, leaving the Air Force short of the confidence needed for operational deployment. Cost became an even sharper obstacle. By late 1961, defense analysts calculated that building and maintaining a fleet of mobile missile trains would cost at least $1 billion more than the fixed silo approach. With Congress already earmarking hundreds of millions for hardening existing silos, the mobile option looked like an expensive experiment. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara reviewed the figures and decided the money would be better spent elsewhere. On December 14, 1961, he ordered the cancellation of the mobile Minuteman program, citing both the unresolved technical risks and the steep price tag. There were also political and diplomatic considerations. Publicly moving nuclear missiles across the country risked drawing unwanted attention at a time when arms control talks were delicate. The idea of nuclear weapons rolling through American towns and cities unsettled both allies and adversaries. For all these reasons, the program was shelved. The Air Force's vision of a mobile, hidden deterrent faded from the defense agenda, but the core idea remained in the background, waiting for a new set of circumstances to bring it back into the spotlight. By the early 1980s, Cold War anxieties returned with new force. The old fear that a Soviet first strike could shatter America's missile force never fully disappeared. In Washington, this anxiety found its champion in President Ronald Reagan. His administration revived the idea of rail-mobile nuclear missiles, not as a technical experiment, but as a full-fledged operational plan. The Air Force called it the Peacekeeper Rail Garrison. This time, the ambition was clear. The program was not satisfied with a handful of prototypes or limited field tests. Defense planners envisioned a network of 25 trains, each carrying 2 Peacekeeper missiles, for a total of 50 warheads. These trains would not be confined to any single region. Instead, they would be ready to crisscross the vast American rail system, vanishing into the background of everyday freight traffic. Unlike the mobile Minuteman, the rail garrison was designed from the start for live deployment. Every detail, from the size of the missile cars to the logistics of crew rotations, was planned for real-world use. The Peacekeeper missile itself was a different beast from the early Minuteman. It measured over 70 feet long, weighed nearly 90 tons, and could carry up to 10 independently targetable warheads. The Air Force argued that only a mobile basing mode could guarantee the survival of such a powerful weapon. In 1983, the rail garrison concept was announced publicly, and Congress authorized funding for design and prototype development. Over the next several years, engineers and contractors worked to build a launch car that could meet the demanding requirements of both the missile and the railroads. The program drew on lessons from the past, but its scale and sophistication went far beyond anything attempted in the 1960s. The logic behind the rail garrison was rooted in the same vulnerability that haunted previous generations of planners. As Soviet missile accuracy continued to improve, the Pentagon's concern shifted from the number of warheads to the survivability of the force. If a missile could be hidden among thousands of freight cars, moving unpredictably across 140,000 miles of track, the odds of an enemy finding and destroying it dropped dramatically. The Peacekeeper rail garrison was meant to make that uncertainty permanent. It was a bet that mobility, secrecy, and the sheer size of America's rail system could keep the nuclear balance intact. For several years, the project pressed forward with urgency, fueled by a sense that the old rules of deterrence no longer offered enough protection. The Peacekeeper rail garrison system was engineered to turn an ordinary-looking freight train into a rolling missile launch center. At its core was the launch car, a specially built rail car designed to hide a 70-foot, 87-ton Peacekeeper missile inside a shell that matched the dimensions and paint scheme of standard 89-foot boxcars. The exterior gave nothing away. On the inside, though, the launch car was a fortress, its steel frame reinforced to handle not just the missile's weight, but the shock and vibration of rail travel and the force of a possible launch. The missile itself sat inside a sealed canister, cradled horizontally during transit. This canister did more than just protect the weapon from weather and dust. It kept the missile aligned, maintained a controlled environment for the warhead, and isolated sensitive electronics from the constant jostling of the rails. Engineers designed the canister with environmental control systems that regulated temperature and humidity, ensuring that the missile's solid propellant and guidance systems would be ready even after days or weeks in motion. Crew spaces were built directly into the train. Each rail garrison set included a hardened crew module, typically positioned just ahead of the launch car. Inside, A two-person launch team worked in a climate-controlled compartment surrounded by racks of secure communications gear and a launch console. The crew lived on board for extended periods, sleeping in bunks and eating in a small galley with their daily routines shaped by strict alert schedules and layers of secrecy. Every command link was hardened against electromagnetic pulse and shielded from outside interference. Secure UHF and SHF radios, along with satellite uplinks, allowed the train to receive coded launch orders from Strategic Air Command at any point along the rail network. The system was designed so that no single person could launch a missile. Each launch required two crew members to turn separate keys, following the same strict protocols used in fixed silos. When a launch order arrived, the process became a tightly choreographed sequence. The train would stop at a pre-surveyed stretch of straight level track, chosen for its stability and clear line of sight. The crew activated the hydraulic raise mechanism, a powerful jack that lifted the missile canister from its horizontal transport position to a vertical launch posture. This operation had to be completed in less than 30 seconds. Sensors and control circuits monitored every step, checking for alignment errors, rail bed deflection, and any sign of malfunction. Engineers had to account for the fact that even a slight tilt caused by uneven track or shifting ballast could throw off the missile's trajectory. To counter this, the launch car's undercarriage was fitted with heavy-duty shock absorbers and leveling systems designed to keep the platform steady during the critical moments before ignition. All protection, communication, and control elements had to work together as a single, integrated system. If any subsystem failed, environmental controls, secure communications, hydraulic lift, or the launch console, the missile could not be fired. The control electronics ran constant diagnostics, and the crew trained for every possible contingency, from power loss to attempted sabotage. The launch car itself was armored against small arms fire and fitted with blast doors that could be sealed in seconds. In the event of a launch, the missile's exhaust would blast through a vent in the roof, and the train's other cars were spaced to prevent damage from heat and debris. The technical demands on engineers and missile crews were relentless. Every component from the canister seals to the radio encryption had to function flawlessly under the strain of real-world rail operations. The system was designed so that, if called upon, a peacekeeper missile could be launched directly from the rails. No special pad, no external support, just a train that moments before looked like any other rolling across the American heartland. Concealment for the missile trains was never about vanishing into thin air. Instead, it relied on the overwhelming scale of American freight traffic. In the late 1980s, the U.S. rail network moved nearly 2 billion carloads each year, creating a river of boxcars, tankers, and hoppers that stretched from coast to coast. Against this backdrop, a single launch car, painted in the same colors, marked with standard railroad logos, built to the same dimensions, became just another piece of rolling stock. The camouflage was not in hiding, but in blending so completely with the ordinary that even a trained observer would struggle to pick out the difference. The entire national rail system became part of the weapon's disguise. With 140,000 miles of track crossing cities, forests, and farmland, the network offered thousands of possible routes and sidings. Missile trains could move at the same pace as commercial freight, stop in small towns or remote stretches, and never linger long enough to draw attention. The Air Force planned to use ghost trains, identical in appearance but carrying no missile at all, to further confuse any attempt at tracking. In a crisis, the doctrine called for rapid dispersal. The moment an alert was received, crews would roll their trains out of secure yards and scatter across the network. This was the dash on warning, a race against the clock to get as many trains as possible away from predictable locations before an enemy missile could reach U.S. soil. Wargaming suggested that if given just 30 minutes notice, most of the rail garrison force could disappear into the system. each train becoming a moving target somewhere along thousands of miles of track. Mobility turned the problem of targeting into a nightmare for any adversary. Instead of fixed coordinates, the enemy faced a constantly shifting puzzle. Every mile a missile train traveled made it harder to predict, harder to find, and nearly impossible to destroy with a single, well-aimed strike. The rail system itself, its size, its routine, its sheer volume, became the shield. In this strategy, survival depended not on invisibility, but on becoming indistinguishable from the everyday machinery of American life. Each mile of track, laid for the peacekeeper rail garrison, carried a weight far beyond steel and timber. The launch cars, disguised as ordinary freight, tipped the scales at nearly 90 tons, triple the weight of a standard boxcar. Sandia National Laboratories measured track deflection under a missile car at over 2 centimeters, a subtle shift with outsized consequences. Even the smallest flex could throw off a missile's alignment, threatening the reliability of a launch. Engineers responded with leveling systems and shock absorbers, but the unpredictability of the railbed remained a constant adversary. Launching a missile from a moving train brought its own set of hazards. The hydraulic lift had to raise the canister and hold it steady, even as the train swayed and the ground underneath shifted. A launch required at least 300 meters of perfectly straight, level track, free from curves, dips, or nearby obstacles. The exhaust plume from the Peacekeeper's first stage would roar through the roof vent, and if the spacing between cars was even slightly off, the blast could damage the train itself. Maintenance teams worked continuously, inspecting and reinforcing track sections, rebuilding launch nodes, and recalibrating equipment to keep the system ready. The logistics of upkeep were staggering. Specialized depots serviced hydraulic lifts, environmental controls, and radiation-hardened electronics. Each train needed custom couplers, reinforced bogies, and layers of armor. Routine maintenance became a round-the-clock operation, with engineers and technicians on standby to address anything from a faulty relay to a cracked weld. The Government Accountability Office put the full life cycle cost of the Peacekeeper program at $21 billion in 1985 dollars, with the mobile rail component adding billions more in hidden expenses. Security concerns shadowed every movement. Moving nuclear warheads across open track made the trains vulnerable to sabotage, theft, or catastrophic accident. Defense Nuclear Agency studies calculated a 1 in a million chance of accidental detonation per million car miles, a risk that could never be entirely erased. The Air Force planned armed escorts and remote monitoring for every route. Launch cars were armored, crewed at all times, and fitted with blast doors that could seal instantly. Yet the decision to blend military assets into civilian railways created vulnerabilities at every crossing, siding, and maintenance stop. The very infrastructure meant to ensure survival introduced new forms of fragility, as engineering, safety, and security demands collided, driving costs ever higher. Inside the sealed compartments of a missile train, secrecy was more than a policy. It was a way of life. Crew members lived under strict need to know rules, carrying cover story identification that listed them as employees of the Federal Railroad Administration. Every conversation, every movement, every phone call home had to be filtered through layers of classified routine. Even family members were told only that their loved ones worked in civilian rail operations. The burden of silence was constant, stretching across weeks spent on alert, isolated from the outside world and from the true purpose of their work. Railroad workers who shared the tracks with these missile trains often had no idea what was rolling past in the night. Civilian engineers, conductors, and maintenance staff might find themselves working alongside a train that looked perfectly ordinary, never knowing it carried enough destructive power to change history in minutes. Communities along the rail lines received only vague notices about strategic transportation activities, with no hint of the hazards moving through their backyards. The ethical weight of this secrecy was heavy. Moving nuclear warheads through populated areas meant that millions of Americans lived and worked close to weapons they could neither see nor question. Studies by the Defense Nuclear Agency estimated the risk of accidental detonation at 1 in a million per million car miles, a vanishingly small number, but not zero. The Air Force planned armed escorts and continuous monitoring, yet the knowledge that a single accident or act of sabotage could bring disaster was never far from the minds of those responsible. For the crews, the secrecy was both shield and shackle. Their mission demanded absolute discretion, but the cost was a life lived in the shadows, carrying a responsibility that could never be shared with the world outside the train. The Peacekeeper rail garrison system never reached the moment it was built for. By the early 1990s, the world that had justified its existence was rapidly disappearing. The Cold War's end arrived not with a missile launch, but with a series of signatures and handshakes in Moscow and Washington. In July 1991, the United States and the Soviet Union signed the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START 1. The agreement set hard limits on the number of deployed intercontinental ballistic missiles and warheads each side could keep. For the first time, the logic of building ever more survivable and mobile missile forces lost its urgency. Congress moved quickly to match the new reality. The Defense Authorization Act of 1992 contained no funding for rail mobile deployment. Lawmakers cited the steep cost of the program, the absence of a clear survivability advantage after START 1, and growing public concern about safety. The Government Accountability Office had already pegged the lifecycle cost of the Peacekeeper program at $21 billion in 1985 dollars, with the rail garrison component adding billions more. Without congressional support, the Air Force could not proceed. Arms control analysts revisited the original premise of mobile basing. Declassified records and post-Cold War research showed that Soviet missile accuracy, while much improved, had never fully matched the threat once feared by U.S. planners. The so-called window of vulnerability, once the rallying cry for mobile deterrence, looked narrower in hindsight. With fewer deployed missiles allowed under START 1, and with the Soviet Union dissolving into the Russian Federation, the political rationale for hiding missiles on trains simply evaporated. The Air Force responded by returning the Peacekeeper missiles to hardened Minuteman silos. The prototype launch cars and specialized crew modules were mothballed or sent to museums. No Peacekeeper was ever launched from a train, and no missile crew ever received a live alert to disperse across the rail network. The rail garrison program, which had absorbed years of engineering work and billions in investment, ended not with a dramatic failure, but with a quiet policy decision. The era of the missile train closed before it ever began, leaving behind blueprints, prototypes, and a lesson in how quickly strategic certainties can vanish. The story of America's missile trains reveals just how far Cold War planners were willing to go to keep the nuclear arsenal out of reach. Moving warheads onto ordinary freight trains blurred the line between military secrets and the rhythms of civilian life. The national rail system, built for commerce and daily routine, became a chessboard for survival, where every mile of track represented a possible hiding place for weapons that could end the world. This approach forced a new kind of calculation, one where survivability depended not on concrete and steel, but on uncertainty and the sheer scale of everyday infrastructure. The idea's influence didn't stop when the programs were canceled. The logic of mobility, of making the enemy search instead of strike, echoed in later debates about how to disperse and protect nuclear forces. Each engineering breakthrough was tested against political reality, budget ceilings, and the uneasy prospect of hiding doomsday weapons in plain sight. In the end, the missile trains left a legacy that sits between technical brilliance and the limits of what a democracy will accept in the name of deterrence. They showed that for a time, the search for security could reshape not just weapons, but the very landscape of American life. Nuclear deterrence still depends on uncertainty. What an enemy cannot see, they cannot destroy. Today, as new technologies track threats in real time, the race to hide, shield, or outmaneuver remains urgent. The logic that once put missiles on trains now drives hypersonic weapons, cyber warfare, and artificial intelligence-driven defense. Secrecy is still survival. The question is, how long can the world keep pace? Let me know what you think in the comments below.